Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. The U.S. military has made an announcement that it will be moving air and missile defense capabilities into Iraq. This is 2 months after there was that tension between the U.S. and Iran, which played out on Iraqi soil. As you know, it started off with the U.S. assassination of Qasem Soleimani, an Iranian general, a high-ranking Iranian general at that, and then the Iranian response with Iran hitting a base that housed U.S. troops as well. A number of those troops, a high number of those troops, in fact, did suffer traumatic brain injuries, as we've learned in the ensuing months as well. The U.S. saying it needs to have that sort of deterrence in its hands to be able to defend itself. This is at a time, of course, as you know, the context that the Iraqis, and parliament at least, have asked for all foreign troops to leave the country. What does that mean then? How does all of this fit into that pattern? And then what does this also mean for Iraq going forward? Will Iraq be okay with having U.S. Protecting itself in this fashion, especially at a time when there has been a bit of talk about Iraq possibly looking into buying S-300 or S-400 systems from Russia also? Let's discuss all of this a bit further. In the context, of course, let me just remind you of the fact that the latest news we've gotten out of Iraq is that 3 soldiers, Western soldiers, 1 UK soldier and 2 US soldiers have been killed in an attack on a military base in Camp Taji. That's in Iraq as well. We're joined now by Michael Lane, who is joining us from Washington, D.C., and we're also joined from Brussels by Guy Burton, who's an adjunct professor of international relations at Vesalius College in Brussels. Guy and Michael, thank you for your time today. Guy, we've had this attack at Camp Taji as well, and there has been seemingly some retaliation on what's being called Iran-backed militias in Iraq as well. Are we going into a heightened escalation once again, where Iran and the U.S. are playing out their differences once again on Iraqi soil?
Well, thank you very much for having me on the show again. And I mean, to answer your question, I assume that most people hope that it won't escalate, although obviously the tensions have been bubbling away over the last couple of months. They never really went away. It's just been a case that there's been a lot more sort of media attention given over to other things that have been going on.
Indeed. So, Michael, what are your thoughts on this point? Because it seems that with the U.S. moving these sort of defense capabilities into the country, that sort of puts us at odds even with the Iraqi parliament's wishes, right?
Yes, it does. After the incident of a couple months ago, there was a great deal of attention paid to the Iraqi parliament saying, well, we would like to have all foreign troops leave Iraq, et cetera. But there's really been no progress on this. The United States is there as the guest of the Iraqi government. There's a status of forces agreement, and we are there to help the government maintain order and to build safety and security for the Iraqi people, as well as to defend against foreign invaders, ISIS, and others. So at this point, with the negotiations really not going anywhere, you have to look at the action of the Iraqi parliament and say, well, it was mostly a show effort and not a realistic effort. There may be, over the course of time, some adjustments to the status of forces agreement, but I believe the United States will be there with the permission of the Iraqi government for the foreseeable future, because the Iraqis know that if the United States leaves, destabilization follows very, very quickly.
I wonder if you agree with that, Guy. If they sort of walk away from Iraq, would that be destabilizing for the country?
Well, I mean, one thing to be said about Iraq as well is that it currently doesn't have a government. That's been going on for over a month now. The last nominee was trying to put together a government during February, and that didn't work out. As of the beginning of March, the president has now got another 2 weeks to try and find a nominee to put forward. Now, the difficulty, of course, is that there is a lot of difference and divisions within the political class in Iraq as to what shape and form the new government should take. So because of that, there doesn't seem to be any leadership coming from Iraq. And so that makes it very difficult for them to be able to communicate and engage with the US as well as others. I mean, just as a sort of a sideshow to all of this, of course, there has been a number of issues relating to OPEC meeting last week, in which we've heard a lot about sort of the Russians and the Saudis splitting over this. Iraq, which is one of the second largest producer in OPEC after Saudi Arabia, its minister for oil wasn't even at that meeting.
That's interesting. So I wonder, Michael, when we're talking about the U.S. role in Iraq at this time, because, when we look at the protests that occurred in Iraq for those many months leading up to the Soleimani assassination, I mean, it still continued, of course, after that, but a conversation about that, muted a bit. The protesters wanted both the U.S. and Iran to leave their country alone. And that seems to be across the board, right? Even officials saying that we do not want to be in the middle of this fight. So then why is it that the U.S. would then still insist on having these sort of defense capabilities, brought to Iraq itself? Why not choose a plethora of other bases closer to Iran, possibly?
Well, I think both sides, both the United States and Iran feel that they have key critical interests in that particular theater, and particularly in the country of Iraq. Both would like to have a government that is more friendly to them than the other side. Both would like to have Iraq pursue policies that are more beneficial to their interests than to the other side. And you must be present to win. You got to be there. You got to be a player in the game and be on the ground, engaging on a regular basis with the Iraqi government, such as it is, as Guy just mentioned, and not very much at this particular time. So if one side or the other were to pick up unilaterally and leave, then it would advantage the other side and disadvantage the side that leaves. I don't think either one is likely to do that. If there happens to be a trilateral agreement where both sides agree to leave, Iran still has the geographical advantage, being a neighbor. They can continue to exert their influence from there. But the United States needs to be in the theater to continue to press its cause, to continue to pursue its interests. And I don't think that the Iraqi government is really going to ask us seriously to leave anytime in the near future. Hopefully down the line. I think President Trump has expressed really that he does want to get out. But it's not going to happen in the immediate future.
What's interesting, Guy, is when there's criticism of the current governance system in Iraq, what many people fail to mention is that this sort of system and the way Iraq is governed currently was brought in since the U.S. invasion of that country in the fall of Saddam Hussein, right? So do you think that the role of the U.S. has been one of stabilizing the country? Because a lot of Iraqis probably would argue against that.
Well, I mean, yes, as you pointed out, the system that's been in place is one that followed the collapse of the Saddam regime and sort of there's the start of the American occupation there after 2004-05. But this is also one that's developed itself. It's become increasingly autonomous. It's not one that has necessarily been sort of imposed from without. I mean, certainly it's also the case that, as Michael's pointed out, the Iranians have a presence there, and even if the Americans were to withdraw, Iran will still be present, and it has actually influence within Iraq in a number of different ways, both within the political class as well as with a number of the paramilitary Shia groups that exist there as well, and in which those paramilitary groups are actually providing some of the security because the federal government itself is unable to completely provide all of that.
Michael, and I'm just going to play devil's advocate for a moment. The Iranians would say, listen, and I believe Zarif said this, or Rouhani, that this is our region. The U.S. is the external player in all of this, so it's fine for us to be involved, to an extent, of course, within our own region, but the U.S. should be the one that's leaving. What do you make of that?
Well, I would expect Iran to continue to press that point. It is their region. However, that doesn't negate the fact that the United States does have critical interest there. We do have alliances and allies in the region, and we do have a very vested interest in seeing that Iraq survives as an independent state and not a satellite state or a client state of the Iranian government. And so, therefore, as the guest of the Iraqi government, we will continue to stay for the foreseeable future.
Okay, so then let's talk about these very specific events that we've seen, Guy, just over the past 24 hours or so when it comes to this Camp Taji attack and then the retaliation as well upon the Iran-backed militia, as is being claimed. Will this possibly, do you think, lead to something more serious? Because, again, it always seems to be that these two countries, i.e. the U.S. and Iran, are always just on the brink, but they seem to always somehow come back from it.
Yeah, and certainly, I mean, what we've also heard in the last 24 hours as well is that after this attack against the camp just north of Baghdad, there were a number of attacks that took place against a number of sort of Shia militias in the east of Syria by a number of currently unidentified warplanes. So what we're going to see is we are going to continue to see this tit for tat. And certainly that was very much the attitude that many people had after the Soleimani killings. And as you pointed out, sort of the retaliation that the Iranians did. I think this will continue to go on, but perhaps not necessarily at a level which is going to escalate too much. I mean, Soleimani was basically, an outstanding case of that simply because of the figure of who he was. It seems very unlikely that this is going to sort of end anytime soon. And just to sort of, make the point as well, even though I alluded to the fact that the Iranians are sort of deeply immersed into the political system in Iraq, it's not necessarily one that is where there is consensus. If you go look at the protest movements that have been going on and are dissipating somewhat since October, there is a sense amongst many of these young activists and protesters that they would like to see both the Americans and the Iranians out, and they want sovereignty. The problem is that doesn't seem to be on the table at the moment.
Indeed, and that keyword sovereignty is in one. I'm going to say thank you to both Michael and Guy for their time and, of course, for their insight, bringing light on this issue. We'll be back right after this break, continuing the discussion on this topic. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're continuing the discussion now on the U.S. decision to place defense missile capabilities, air and missile defense capabilities into Iraq, and the past 24 hours events, specifically when it comes to Camp Taji, north of Baghdad as well, where one UK soldier and 2 American soldiers have been killed in a rocket attack, and then there's been retaliation to that attack as well on quote-unquote Iran-backed militias in that country. To discuss that further, we're now joined by Lily Hamourtziadou, who is a senior lecturer at Birmingham City University and principal researcher of the Iraq body count. She is joining us now from Staffordshire in the UK. And joining us from Budapest is George Szamuely, who is an author and journalist. He's senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute. George and Lily, thank you both for your time today. George, let me start with you. For the U.S. to be placing Patriot missiles, essentially, in Iraq, what does that mean for Iraq itself? That just means it solidifies its position further, doesn't it, as the theater of this war, really, Cold War, or however, soft war or silent war between the U.S. and Iran.
Absolutely. And of course, Iraq will have no say whatsoever in this, even though it will be deployed on Iraqi soil. I mean, the United States has already made clear that Iraq will have no say on anything pertaining to the U.S. military presence in the country. It does, of course, endanger the Iraqi people, because of course they do become targets. The real reason for this deployment is the response to the attack on the military base in January from Iran. This was a real blow to American prestige. Countries don't just attack United States armed forces and the United States does not respond. And particularly when such attacks inflict casualties. And it's clear that there were serious casualties as a result of the Iranian attack. So this Patriot missile deployment is anticipation of further possible Iranian attacks. But Iran isn't going to attack. Iran would only attack in retaliation for U.S. attacks. So it may be in anticipation of future U.S. attacks on Iran.
Lily, Americans would always say that, listen, we have an agreement with the Iraqis, and the Iraqis probably behind the scenes have agreed to this somehow. However, then there's that huge paradox, right, with the Iraqi parliament's decision, in which it clearly said after the Soleimani assassination that we want all foreign troops out. What do you make of that?
Yeah, it's very interesting that you mentioned, and I agree with George 100% in what he's saying about this war really always having been about domination and intimidation. It's very interesting that the USA and now the UK have a sort of alliance with the government, the democratically elected government of Iraq, because Working for Iraq Body Count, I follow the security developments on a daily basis. And I know that since 2005, that Iraq has had a democratically elected government. That government has killed around 6,000 Iraqi civilians. And that the West is so happy to have an ally in a government like this makes the claim that to remove Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath regime, which was killing its own people, an objective of that war, sound a little bit untrue. So Iraq is in a position now where it has insecurity internally. Civilians are still being killed every day. There is a government that is an ally in the USA, but also an ally in Iran. And as George said, now more than ever, Iraqi civilians, I think, are at great risk.
Okay, so then, George, what happens next? Because we right now have political instability within Iraq still continuing, right? Because of those protests that have been playing out on the streets throughout the country, especially in major cities such as Baghdad and otherwise. Through that instability, do you think it is that all of these external players are trying to take advantage of the situation, trying to, get their interests forward in the country at this time?
Well, I think the Iraqi instability will continue to grow, largely as a result of this, the economic crisis brought on by dropping oil prices. This is going to create additional hardships for Iraq. I mean, Iraq has already been suffering as a result of the sanctions on Iran and the maximum pressure campaign on Iran from the United States. So this adds to the economic crisis in Iraq, and hence the political turmoil in Iraq. The question now is, for instance, the war against ISIS. Now, the United States has pretty much done nothing in the recent past since the Iraqi parliamentary vote to expel all foreign forces from Iraq. The United States has done nothing to fight ISIS, which is the ostensible justification for the U.S. Military presence in Iraq. So what's happening now is that ISIS is growing in strength while the U.S. is still blustering about Iran. So, at the moment, political turmoil plus growth in strength of ISIS, and we're kind of waiting for the next phase of the U.S. administration's ongoing war against Iran.
That's interesting, isn't it, Lily? Because the Iraqi people certainly have made their feelings very clear, haven't they, through those protests that have been occurring, where they've said, listen, we don't want any of the above involved. We want to deal with our own issues ourselves. However, this governing system, as I put to an earlier guest as well, that we currently have in Iraq was one that was brought in after the fall of Saddam Hussein, heavily influenced, of course, by the U.S., considering it was the occupying power and arguably still very much is. Can we move beyond such a system? Will the Iraqi people be able to get their wish for an actually sovereign government which takes sovereign decisions, not based on the influence of any external powers?
I don't believe so, is sadly my answer, because this war and invasion were always about having control of Iraq and having control of the border with Iran. Because of regional power struggles that the West has involved itself in. And I don't believe this war was ever about the Iraqis any more than it was for the people of Afghanistan, for example. And so because of all these interests that are being served with the continuing instability, Iraq will always be under some sort of control by an external power, whether it's through militia or through military bases or through simply occupation.
So, George, if tomorrow, for example, the Americans keep saying that we are in Iraq at the invitation of the Baghdad government and we're going to stay and remain as long as that agreement is in place. If tomorrow, do you think the Iraqis were to genuinely say, we want all of you out, would the Americans just walk away?
I doubt it. I think the Trump administration has made clear that, before it walks away, is going to demand compensation from Iraq, payment for those wonderful military bases that the United States has built for the past 17 years. So before the United States were to walk out, it would make one demand after another on the Iraqi government, with, in the meantime, probably fueling some kind of an ISIS insurgency within Iraq, which the Iraqi military will probably not be able to cope with, and thus providing further justification for American military presence. Because if ISIS is growing in strength, then it does seem a little ridiculous for the Iraqis to be demanding the United States to withdraw. So you can be pretty sure that the Americans will make conditions so unbearable for Iraq that withdrawal of the United States would soon be the last thing on their mind.
You know, Lily, one of the arguments the Iranians have put forth in the past few months is that it's the U.S. which should be leaving the region as a whole, certainly, but also even Iraq, because, you know, it's the external player for the region as a whole. And Iran is a neighbor. You know, obviously one can argue certainly that even Iranians should not be interfering in Iraq, certainly. But do you think there is some merit to that argument where, okay, regional countries should be the ones dealing with the issues, even if those issues are surrounding Iraq?
Yes, certainly. I believe that is a possible solution. Definitely what isn't a solution is this constant military solutions that the West has to fight a group or a state in the Middle East, a region very far away from where we live. And I believe those military solutions that the West always has at the ready actually make us all much more insecure. I mean, even people living in Europe and in the USA now, I think because of these constant interventions and constant attacks on targets in the Middle East, are actually feeding the narrative of extremists and of groups like the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. And I think that makes us all much more insecure and is certainly the wrong response.
Very well. We'll leave there as a final, but of course we appreciate both George and Lily for their time today and putting this all into context for us. Viewers, we've spoken to 4 guests so far, Michael, Lily, Guy, and George, and we've tried to give you the context of, you know, all sides of the story, because the Iranians have their argument, right, for why they're possibly involved in Iraq to an extent, because it's a neighboring country and they're there, again, at the invitation of certain Iraqi politicians. And on the other side, the Americans say, we're also there at the invitation of certain Iraqi politicians and factions seemingly in the country. And the Americans have a deal to the Status of Forces Agreement, as Michael had pointed out in his answers earlier. However, with the placement of now defense missile capabilities within Iraq, this causes a number of issues, doesn't it? As I had put to George as well, this solidifies the position of Iraq as the very theater now of continuing war between the U.S. and Iran, even if that's a secret war, even if that's a street-to-street war, even if that's not open warfare as we would understand it. However, it is war at some level, isn't it? And this is something that the Iraqi people certainly do not want. They've made that very clear. They don't want any foreign forces involved in their country. They want to be able to make sovereign decisions, independent decisions, just in their own national interests. This goes against that. Placing Patriot missiles will create many issues for Iraq. It will not probably then have the option to even look to the Russians, for example, to buy the S-300 or S-400, as I'd put in my introduction as well. We'll keep a close eye on this, certainly, because this will have ramifications, won't it, in the coming days, months, and even years. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Greece. And we know that we've been discussing, of course, the migrant crisis. And we can always talk about, of course, the Turkey angle and all of this. But just for a moment, I wanted to concentrate on a report that the New York Times has just released recently, over the past 24 hours, an exclusive about possible black sites. And that's a description that the UN or a former UN official has used. And he has mentioned Francois Crépeau, who was a former UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights of migrants, said it was the equivalent of a domestic black site since detainees are kept in secret and without access to legal recourse. Now, as we know, Greece has currently taken very tough measures to try to stem this flow of migrants onto its territory and into Europe as a whole. Europe is supporting it at this point in time. But what does all of this mean for Europe's moral responsibility, Greece's moral responsibility, international law vis-a-vis those who are seeking asylum, fleeing from persecution of all sorts from around the world. These are not just Syrians. It's important to remember, but people from all over the world, really, Africans and others who are amongst these group of migrants who are showing up at Greece's door. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Bill Frelick, who is the Refugee Rights Program Director at Human Rights Watch. He's joining us now from Washington, D.C. And joining us from Athens is Dimosthenis Dimopoulos, who is a researcher at the Institute of International Relations. Dimosthenis and Bill, thank you both for your time today. Dimosthenis, let me start with you. Tell us about what the mood is right now in Greece about these migrants. And what is the feeling about how the Greek government is treating them at this time? Are there concerns about whether this is being done keeping international law in mind?
Well, let me begin by saying that Greece currently is facing an unprecedented crisis, which is being manufactured by Turkey. Turkey, trying to get out of the deadlock and the dead end it's found itself in Syria and everywhere else, is trying to destabilize Greece, extort the European Union for more financial aid, and it's trying to appease its internal public, which is being very negative about Erdogan. We saw it today with the new party that's been established by the former friend of Erdogan and all that.
But then, Dimosthenis, if I may come in just for a moment, does that excuse, though, how Greece is treating these people? Because, you know, again, as I said in my introduction, certainly there is that angle of Turkey that needs to be discussed, but just on how Greece itself is treating these people. I mean, these people are not themselves either pro-Turkey or pro-Greece or anti either way, right? These are just people seeking safety from persecution of some sort.
And the majority of reports I've seen with interviews of those individuals on the other side of the border, they're not Syrians. The vast majority of those people are not Syrians. They're Afghans. And they all been speaking Turkish very fluently. And they have many reports. I've seen a report with reporters, Greek reporters, being there interviewing like 60, 70, 80 people at a time live on camera. And all of them spoke Turkish fluently. They all said they've been living in Turkey for 4, 5, 6 years. Mm-hmm. So there are not people living from Idlib at the moment. There's no influx of refugees from Idlib at the moment. All of them are in the Turkish-Syrian border. Turkey is not allowing them to cross through. So these people, most of them are not Syrians. And Greece is preventing them from crossing illegally the Greek border.
Okay, let me bring you in, Bill. What are your thoughts on this? Just again, going back to how Greece itself is dealing with this. I mean, sure, this is a tough situation for Greece to find itself in, considering it is right at the border with Turkey, and the situation exists at this time. But nevertheless, it's human beings caught in all of this, right? So they're the ones who are being sent to these possible black sites, if we are to accept this New York Times report as it's being presented to us. That's worrying, is it not, for how Greece and Europe will deal with this going forward?
Yes, well, I just returned actually from Lesbos. I was there until just a couple of days ago, talking to many of the refugees that your previous speaker just spoke about. And I spoke to many of them about the conditions in their home countries, including Syria and Afghanistan. And many of them I thought had quite credible asylum claims. And also many of them articulated fears of remaining in Turkey as well. Turkey itself has been pushing Syrians back at its border with Syria. Idlib has been mentioned, and the previous speaker is absolutely correct. We're documenting pushbacks on that border as well. But what I was seeing in Lesbos and what my colleagues at Human Rights Watch are seeing on the Turkish side of the Greek-Turkey border are summary pushbacks of people, the suspension of the right to lodge asylum claims in Greece. I was attempting to get onto the naval boat that's docked at the Mytilene harbor and was denied permission to enter that boat. But I spoke by telephone to people who are on that boat. They're being detained there. They're not being accorded their basic rights. And there's a real risk that the foundation of refugee law, which is the principle of non-refoulement, the idea that a person should not be sent back to a place where they would be persecuted, they're subjected to severe harm, that people are being sent back having a chance to make a claim for protection and to explain the reasons why they fear being returned.
Dimosthenis, what do you make of that? Because do you not think that it's important for each person to be given a case-by-case basis, proper procedure to be able to present why they really are legitimate asylum seekers?
The thing is on that, there's already a ruling of the European Court of Human Rights that ruled in favor of Greece when 3 or 2 Syrians with a Turkish lover came and tried to do a cease and desist on the very recent decision of the Greek Governmental Council of National Security that did postpone and did declare that all the asylum claims should be not discussed for a month, and that ruled in favor of that of Greece. And also Greece is at the moment facing a very national security threats by the way Turkey is handling the whole situation by claiming and telling people that hundreds of thousands are crossing through the border, which is not the case. And also we have the spread of the coronavirus. So we have both public health safety concerns and public security concerns that are justifying Greece to temporarily suspend.
Dimosthenis, I wonder what you make of the argument that many in this region and the countries that are currently hosting a lot more refugees than Europe ever has throughout any of these crises. I mean, Turkey is hosting millions. There are other countries in this region who have hosted millions in their own respective fashions. Lebanon is hosting a lot of refugees, has hosted them for many, many years. Do you not think that at some level that Greece is possibly shying away from a bit of its responsibilities, or Europe as a whole? I'm not trying to put this just on Greece. I mean, Greece is part of the EU after all. Do you not think that the EU should also be shouldering some responsibility as well?
The EU should be, everybody should be. The USA should be, every country, Russia should be, every country should be of the region. And Greece already is hosting several thousands, if not 100,000 refugees, if not more already. So definitely that's not, the accusations from Greece, for Greece are not really justified on that regard, because we're the gateway alongside with Italy for Europe, and we're already hosting great amount of refugees, technically more than our economy can sustain. And what I want to say is that it's important to understand that Turkey has gathered all these refugees, inviting them, whether they're not Syrians or from Afghanistan or everywhere else. So, and judging Greece for not accepting hundreds of thousands more of people, which it cannot deal with, we should consider why is Turkey aggressively sending those people to the Greek borders. They're paying taxis, buses, train fares. They're making fake announcements by ministers of the state saying, go to the borders. We have videos of Turkish officials, security forces and all that, holding children at gunpoint, forcing their families to return back to the borders.
Okay.
Who is supplying the refugees with the Molotov cocktails, the gases they're throwing to the Greek side? These are big questions.
All right. So okay. If I could just come to Dimosthenis, I want to get Bill back in on this conversation. There's also been, a couple of videos which have been concerning, and especially a video of, I believe it was the Greek Coast Guard ship, and it possibly firing on refugees or asylum seekers, as we may term them better. There are those sorts of concerns, right, where we're losing our touch. Sure, the EU has sided with Greece right now in not accepting asylum for at least a month or so. However, there seems to be something which is going wrong within the system, within this bloc, which claims that it is so humane and moral, etc. And if there are concerns about, how they're being treated in XYZ country, why not at least try to treat them in a more humane fashion, even if you are to then reject their asylum at the end of the day?
Yeah, there are mechanisms, legal mechanisms, for suspending individual asylum procedures in an emergency, but that doesn't mean that you have carte blanche to summarily return people. What you need to do in its place is to provide temporary protection until you can sort out those asylum claims. So the principle of non-refoulement is not compromised by suspension of individual procedures as long as temporary protection is in effect. The problem here is that Greece is now summarily returning both at its land border and at its sea borders, people who are seeking asylum. On the land border, they're stripping people down to their underwear. They're beating them. They're pushing them back. On the land, on the sea, Coast Guard is in Greek waters, creating wakes using high-powered Coast Guard vessels to try to tip the rafts over. They're literally using poles to push boats back. And we've talked to asylum seekers who say that the motors have been taken off of their rafts to disable them. We have also spoken, and I've spoken myself, to refugees that are currently in Lesbos at the Moria camp that went down to the shore because they had messages from their relatives that were aboard a boat. And they saw crowds of people, Greek local people, throwing rocks at the boat, preventing it from landing, and then beating up the people that I spoke to, the refugees that are currently at Moria, and pushing them back into the camp. So this is hardly comports with the legal principles of refugee protection, even in an emergency. And I will just hasten to add one more thing.
Sure.
In 2015, those emergency temporary protection procedures were not invoked, with far more, nearly 900,000 people that entered the European Union at that time, and they did not resort to any suspension of individual procedures. So the numbers are quite small relative to that, and yet Greek is invoking not only a suspension of individual procedures, but is actually summarily mistreating people and pushing them back across the border.
Okay, we'll have to leave that as a final word. This conversation, there's a lot more to continue about this, certainly, and a lot more context to be added. And I know this is a tough conversation to be had as well between the Greek and Turkish disagreement over this issue. However, it's important to also look at this on a case-by-case basis, right? So we can talk about the Turkish side of things. However, the Greek side of things also, because Greece is part of the EU, a bloc which claims it has moral authority in many of these such cases when it comes to migrant issues or otherwise, is not actually following through on its responsibilities at this time, is it? These are, at the end of the day, as I said in one of my questions, these are human beings who are caught in the middle of all this, and they seem to be used, as they've said themselves, some of them, that they've been used as pawns almost, and they're being mistreated. I mean, the New York Times article goes into great detail about how these people were mistreated both at sea and in these detention sites, or black sites, as a former UN official on human rights has termed them, possibly. This is not in keeping with what would be a tradition of democracy or human rights or humane treatment of any sort of any human beings, even if you are to then reject their asylum applications, if you say this is all conspiracy by Turkey, all of that put to one side. Nevertheless, you have moral responsibilities. There are responsibilities within international law about how refugees and migrants and asylum seekers must be treated at your border. You cannot simply mistreat any human being, especially in Europe, which, as I said, continues to hold moral authority over the rest of us around the world. We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here in Scope. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.